Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's a Saturday, and it's always good to see that there are people who are interested in engaging in critical conversations, and in contributing to those conversations, and also thinking about what their role is after those conversations. Um, we hope that this will be one such conversation. If you're joining for the first time, then welcome, and we're really excited that you are part of this. Um, Today's topic and conversation is it's really part of a 9 series of interactive webinars. And the purpose of the series has been to really acquaint South African activists and people with the nature of reforms required to reverse South Africa's downward trajectory. And the purpose of that really is just to take advantage and try to understand what those missed opportunities were, and to think about how we can become a successful modern constitutional state that increases jobs and substantially narrows inequality. Um, and so if you've joined us before, you would have been privy to the conversations that have taken place leading up to this one. Some of the topics include the global trends that have been tailor-made to create South African jobs, the economy and what South Africa should learn from China, Japan, and selected high-growth African states. Last week's, or a couple of weeks, the most recent one was sequencing reforms in justice and security. And today, what we are focusing on is fixing teaching and the education environment. And that's quite a broad topic, because it focuses both on, I think, the missteps that were taken in relation to how teaching is done in the country, but then also the education environment that either hinders specific outcomes or propels other outcomes, and what those outcomes are, and what the education system, what the role of the system itself is doing in producing those outcomes. We have a really great panel with us today, and I'm going to just introduce them, and then we'll hand over to John Mattison, who really is the leader of this 9-part webinar series. John is a South African journalist, author, and policy consultant. He published his second book, and I think his most recent book, called Cyril's Choices: An Agenda for Reform, in 2019, which really explained how South Africa's missteps led to the current malaise, and how to go about changing that. That book is based on 4 years in the Mandela administration, and then as a member of the SABC Interim Board in 2017. His work in the United Nations as chairperson of the Electoral Media Commission in Afghanistan, and the acting project manager of the UN's election project. Also, of his lifetime study of the successes and failures in national economic turnarounds, that he started at the University of Chicago, and during which he studied the cases of Japan and Russia in particular. John, we're really happy for you to be able to lead this webinar today, and we're looking forward to a critical conversation and an engaging one. I'll introduce our other speakers as well before I hand over to you, John. And so the second speaker and respondent is Elizabeth Biney. Elizabeth Biney is the head of a research and policy unit at Equal Education, which I think is an organization that is known to all of us. But it's a civil society organization that really advocates for quality and equality in the South African education system. Elizabeth's specific research experiences cut across the humanities, social sciences, and the law, and her research interests include immigration, social protection, social justice, and youth development, all as they intersect with education in South Africa. And then our last speaker and respondent is Anne Bernstein. Anne heads the Center for Development and Enterprise in South Africa, which is really regarded by many, including the London Financial Times, as the country's leading policy center for social and economic development. CDE has a special focus on the role of business and its contribution to development. And Anne, in particular, It has an extensive CV, which includes her membership of the transition team and then board of the Development Bank of South Africa. She was a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington. In 2007, she joined the board of the Brenthurst Foundation. And then in both 2008 and 2009, she was an invited faculty member at the World Economic Forum. And she still continues to participate in the Global Agenda Council's initiative. Her book, The Case for Business in Developing Economies, was published by Penguin in 2010 and won the Anthony Fisher Prize in 2012. She's a regular public speaker and has been published by newspapers around the country, often appearing on radio and TV. Her many other publications and books include Migration and Refugee Policies, Business and Democracy, Cohabitation or Contradiction, and Policy Making in a New Democracy, South Africa's Challenges for the 21st Century. Okay, so John, I'll hand over to you. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Just before we hand over, maybe just to draw your attention to the chat, where Chetza, who is our administrative Fundi, has posted a link to access a tool which has a set question about education in South Africa. And just as part of our desire to make this interactive, we want you to please try to respond to that question while you're listening to the inputs and contributions. But we'll probe a little further and give an opportunity for further questions and answers toward the end. So thanks so much, John. You can take over from here.
Thanks very much, Kristen, and morning to everyone. Please excuse my voice. 12 days ago, I had surgery on my vocal cords, and I was banned from speaking until 2 days ago. They assure me I'm making a full recovery, but I'm afraid I'm croaking a little bit. I hope you can understand me. If there's a problem, please let me know. So this is the second last webinar in the series, aimed at developing a new vision for South Africa that is achievable and understandable to the public. In each area we've looked at, I think it's been clear that substantial reforms are needed to turn things around, but also that these reforms are entirely within the grasp of South Africans, if we're willing to recognize the problems and put our collective minds to solving them. Now, with the election only 2.5 months away, it's clear there will be new faces in cabinet, whether the ANC gets 50% or not, because a lot of long-serving ministers are retiring. And of course, there may well be coalition partners in the cabinet if there's a coalition. Now, how have they done so far? How has the government done so far? Well, the number of students in schools is substantially higher than it was under apartheid. And the education is budgeted one of the highest in the world compared to per capita GDP. There's nevertheless substantial research showing that we're not getting enough money. We've fallen behind our peers and even some of our neighbors. I assume that many in the audience, like you, have an audience like this. If you've read some of the surveys done, so I won't labor the bad stats. Both the other speakers, Anne Bernstein at the CPE and Liz at the EE, have highlighted them in their reports, and they're widely published and available on their website. Someone needs to mute themselves. Okay. We've talked a lot here about South Africa's extreme unemployment problem. As you know, that includes obviously matriculants and those without a matric. So today I want to focus on the kind of steps for early reform that can be taken in education, and our role as citizens who can demand practical fixes from the government. And if they're done, it will create the momentum for an ongoing culture for further reform, because people will see the benefits. I don't believe the next government will make the necessary changes if we don't pressure as ordinary citizens to ensure them. So I'm hoping to inspire you in my croaky voice for all of us to be advocates for reform. There are many who need it, but starting a period of reform is tricky. There are strong interest groups likely to stand in the way in a lively and unruly democracy like ours. So if you start with the wrong ones, you can get bogged down by organized resistance. For example, excuse me, some in the parliamentary opposition focus their attacks on SADTU, the trade union, and they have some good grounds. A 2016 ministerial task team reported that positions like principal and deputy principal in schools were being sold for money, sex, or livestock. It also found that SADTU was in de facto charge of the management, administration, and educational priorities in at least 6 of the 9 provinces. Obviously, this is very serious, but it's not productive to blindly attack trade unions. Smart reform needs to avoid that trap. Taking on abuses needs to be carefully managed. A second important interest group is parents. Parents can be an immense support in strengthening education, and there are many examples. But parents have to be brought with you if you want reform to work. One example where this applies is in mother tongue education. Research strongly favors mother tongue education in the foundation years in school. In 47% of grades 4 classrooms across the country, not a single learner could read in their home language and make inferences. But one educationist warned me when I first raised it that parents often simply refuse to allow mother tongue education for their children. They feel, and it's understandable, that their child's life chances depend on English, and they don't trust the system that starts them off in the mother tongue to catch them up in English later. There are, of course, areas other than that others advocate for reform for. For example, I looked into why we still have pitcher trees. By the middle of last year, there remained 3,300 schools still using pitcher trees, in which small children have died. I calculated that the budget allocated to build toilets was 2.5 million rand per school, which seems to me quite adequate, but it hasn't happened. It seems inconceivable that we go year after year with this debate. But the obvious solution to me is to put one person in charge that everybody knows is in charge of getting rid of pitcher trees and is publicly accountable until it's done. I know that Equal Education has done work on infrastructure, and I'll be keen to hear insights from Liz when she gets a chance to talk. Zinzi, could you put up the first slide? I'm not going to deluge you with stats, but I just want to show you these two because they are so significant. What this shows is that only about 20% of children aged 10 could read for meaning in any language. I know Anne's study has highlighted this point, and it's obviously a very hair-raising one. But the other stat is that about 24% of children who started grade 1 all those years ago passed matric with university passes last year, or I think it was actually 2021, that study. So those numbers correlate quite closely. In other words, if you don't learn to read for meaning in the first 4 years of school, there's a very good chance there'll be exceptions, but there's a very good chance you'll never catch up. So if our children can't learn to read, they can't read to learn. If they can't read to learn, they're unlikely to pass a matric, which reduces their chances of employment. In addressing these issues, I want to apply 2 key insights. And if you could put up the second slide. To me, if you take away these 2 insights with you, I feel it's worthwhile because they dwarf just about everything else. The first insight is that the first years of life matter the most in determining a child's life prospects. So early brain stimulation is vital. The first 1,000 days of life are when a child's brain develops the fastest. And the second insight is that no education system can be better than the quality of its teachers. So, if early brain stimulation and access to books and reading make all the difference, what would it take to enable children to read for meaning by the age of 10? Well, the government is aware of these stats and has tried to tackle it. Between 2006 and 16, the number of grade 4 children who couldn't read for meaning improved from 87% to 78%. And that's a pre-COVID rate. If at that pre-COVID rate, it would take us until 2096 before all our children could read for meaning. And of course, COVID set us back. So what that tells us is the government is doing something constructive, but it's not nearly enough. So what else can be done that would be evident and visible, and which ordinary South Africans can demand and monitor? To me, the leadership here is absolutely critical. Parents have to be shown in a high-profile, regular way what is needed. One overseas study showed that when the proportion of parents reading to their children at bedtime rose from 40% to 70%, reformers generated greater parental involvement in education and transformed their technical program and created a massive difference. So we need ministers and other leaders in the field, publicly and privately, with public money, privately money, encouraging people to understand, parents and caregivers, that their children need stimulation from the earliest possible date. The fact is, in South Africa, many caregivers say babies and toddlers under the age of 2 are too young for books and play. Research by UNICEF and the Department of Basic Education found that even in households with access to some books, only 32% of caregivers reported reading regularly to young children. Also, 43% of households with young children don't have a single book in their home, and only 16% have more than 5. These early indicators tell you that outcomes will be poor. As to the schools, more than 17,000 or 70% of public schools don't have libraries. And even those that do, more than a third, 2,133, are not stocked with books. This is a leadership problem. And it's not obviously money would help, but an education minister can make dramatic strides by championing a culture of reading and learning publicly and consistently. Parents and caregivers need to get the message. There's no excuse for the fact that caregivers are not informed or parents are not fully informed, that the future of their children is in their hands, and these are the tools to get them there. There's enormous public goodwill to be tapped, and anybody willing to help should be embraced. There are retired teachers who would help if they're made to feel more wanted. There are parental groups that are doing it on their own but could use their help. And there should be organized public appeals for the right books for schools. There should be a national project. It should include removing VAT on books, calling on the government, charities, philanthropies, and well-meaning citizens to donate books to deprive schools, to libraries, and to households. To encourage mother tongue instruction, we need to encourage publishers and writers to write children's books in African languages as well as English. Of course, the most obvious aid to solving this problem is an early childhood development program. In 2021, only 28% of children were on them. But lack of money shouldn't stop the process. There's so much that can be done by getting everybody to understand the right things that are needed. And where this has been tried, the results have been good. There was research in Limpopo where children were equipped with workbooks and teachers with teachers' guides, with teaching guides, which they didn't have before that. And extra face-to-face training, 60% learning increase compared to before they did this. It's about stimulating young brains with books. So that for me is the first big reform I think needs to be pushed, and it needs to be pushed with leadership as much as with money. The second step that I think is vital is teaching assistance. I quote the founder of Future Nation Schools, Sizwe Nkosana, saying there is no education system that can be better than the quality of its teachers. Another way to put it, which might sound more controversial, is a good teacher under a tree will produce better results than a bad teacher in a pristine classroom. We have comparisons of the proficiency levels of South African teachers. We were ranked at 41% compared to Kenya's 95% and Zimbabwe's 87%. Although I suspect Zimbabwe's has declined since that survey. The short-term answer to this is to compensate for weak teaching by bringing teacher support into the classroom. I've seen this, by the way, in schools in KwaZulu-Natal, and it really works. So how do you do that when you can't solve the problem with money immediately? Well, Professor Jonathan Jansen makes the point that the way to do it fast and improve teaching and teaching assistance is for trainee teachers to reverse the amount of time they develop on theory and practice, to give them 70% of each day spent as teaching assistants in classrooms, and only 30% back in their teacher's college or university, learning lessons from the day's teaching and enriching what they learned in practice. And this has been tried in some countries, it works, but obviously teaching assistants are vital. We should get them wherever we can. Unemployed graduates should be offered a year as teaching assistants. Many retired teachers are willing to assist. Skilled foreign teachers, where it's appropriate. So those for me are the two most important things. I'll just raise in my remaining time a few of the other the other issues that I can touch on. Obviously, universal testing for teachers has got to come back. They need to write exams to be subject to assessments on the content knowledge of the subjects they're teaching themselves. I'll say a word about headmasters. The minimum qualification required for the job are a matric, a 4-year teaching qualification, a police clearance certificate, a driver's license, and 7 years teaching experience. In 2012, only 70% of principals met that criteria. But those criteria are inadequate. Education experts say over and over again, 7 years of teaching doesn't qualify anybody to lead a school. By the way, in 2012, only 15% were extremely well qualified with a postgraduate. We need to up our requirements from headmasters, principals. We also need to reinstall school inspectors. And part of that is restoring accountability, leadership capacity. Now, this has been discussed before, but the difficulty is union and other resistance, but that's got to be addressed. Even if it's not the first thing that's addressed, it's got to be addressed. The other problem we have is that principals are appointed by parent bodies, and the school governing bodies were a good initiative after 1994. But they haven't monitored their success effectively because 80% of school governing bodies are considered to be dysfunctional. So again, and deemed not to possess the necessary insight and skills to carry out their responsibility. So obviously, and as in everything else we've discussed, reform is really a permanent process. And what has been missing in the government, we talked about it extensively on economic policy, but really just across the board, is a culture of error correction. And I mean quick error correction. Doesn't matter if you make a mistake, you need to make mistakes when you try new ideas, but you need to monitor the consequences and react when they need it. We also, just to touch on a few things before I finish off with tertiary education, we now know that teachers training systems, and the system is producing only a third of the requirements of around 25,000 teachers a year, and that the age profile of teachers suggests we may soon face a teacher shortage because more than 2/3 of teachers are over the age of 40. This is an opportunity to train teachers the way we want to, but it has to be embraced. It can't be ignored. And finally, on teachers, I would suggest that if you look at the successful systems in different countries, Finland, South Korea, performance incentives for good teachers should be in place. People's salaries should be linked to outcomes. I want to say a word about teachers' union. The teachers' union said to, of course, there is a dysfunctional relationship between the government and SADTU. It has to be tackled carefully. Obviously, many teachers and SADTU members do care about the quality of education they provide. They must be sought out and empowered to reprioritize education excellence. Resistance should be expected, but the principle of politics-free schools must be put on the table. We have to take the politics out of schools. Absolutely essential. And of course, that also includes the necessity, the ability to get merit-based teaching promotions. On tertiary education, just to finish with that, over the past decade or more, many of our tertiary education institutions have become chronically unstable. There's growing corruption and deviation from the principles that should embody a culture of learning and prepare young people for fulfilling employment. Jonathan Janssen's last book was on this, on corruption in universities. But again, there's a period of research. The decline hasn't been universal, but a considerable number of universities have serious malfunction among vice chancellors, chairs of council, members of the parliamentary portfolio committees, union leaders, student leaders, registrars, deans, professors. A new minister must set the values expected in institutions, including academic excellence, integrity, and the principles of academic freedom and inclusion, that treats all students and staff as equally valuable, regardless of their nationality, race, or other identity. Finally, on technical training, as been well documented, technical training was downgraded after 1994. And by the way, this is a characteristic of other post-liberation African countries. There was an emphasis on going to university, but the result is that we have a shortage of blue-collar workers, and the minister needs to demonstrate the respect for the value of technical careers that they deserve. It's vital to rebuilding the economy, and of course, as we discussed in previous webinars, the slide of deindustrialization, which is long-term in South Africa, has to be turned around by opening door and the trades open doors to good income and fulfilling lives. So just to conclude, if we all insist that education leaders, from the minister down, educate the public as well as the education system about real education solutions, the results will be dramatic and truly transformative. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. I think for setting the scene broadly on a lot of these issues and then going a little bit more in depth into some of them. It's a dire state of affairs, and it's difficult to listen to and to be able to think that reform is possible and that there is actually hope, especially I think given the plethora of issues and how they intersect with each other. We'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the conversation through discussion and some questions and answers, and I'll try to probe further on some of the thoughts that I have as well. But for now, I'd like to give Anne and Elizabeth the opportunity to please respond to John's presentation. And I think you can go first, and then Elizabeth, you can follow immediately afterwards. Thanks. Sorry, Anne, you're muted. Just unmute. That's good.
Thanks very much, and I'm delighted to be here. I think John uses a lot of material from our documents, and that's great. But we come to somewhat different conclusions about what must be done. So let me start this way. South Africa has a very large and complex basic education system, and I think most people don't appreciate how big this is. And that I've often argued this is one of the biggest management challenges, change management challenges that faces the country. So very quickly, we have about 700 staff in the national office of DBE. There are 9 provincial education departments, 30,000 people. There are 80 education districts. There are 23,000 public schools, 320,000 teachers, and about 13 million learners. This is not a simple task, and people need to bear this in mind. The issue is not money. South Africa spends proportionately a very high percentage of our budget compared to almost any other country. We're in the top countries allocating resources to basic education. The real issue is how we spend that money and why we're not making progress in sufficient sort of leaps to get to even the level of Kenya, never mind some of the star performers in the world. So let me tell you a story, and this is about the Minister of Education in Peru. Jamie Saavedra is a Peruvian who was asked 2012, 2013 by the President and the Minister of Finance to come back from Washington and to run the education department. He thought about it and he went back to the President and he said, I have one condition. Be nice if some of our ministers had a few conditions as well, but he had one condition. He said, I am the person who hires and fires, and there's no politics in appointments. They agreed to this, and they gave him their backing. And within 3 years, he only stayed for 3 years, he had replaced 55 of the top 60 officials in the education department. He wanted people who were fit for purpose, and he moved, he acted. He also achieved enormous successes. Within 5 to 6 years, Peru, which had come last in one of the international tests, they had moved up 12 countries in 6 years. And he did things, not rocket science, it's everything we know. You've got to have good teachers who are not evaluated by themselves. You have to have good principles. You have to do all sorts of things. So he didn't do anything we haven't heard of. He just did it with determination, and he appointed the right people to run the department. That's critical. So I think when anyone thinks about reform, any kind of reform in a developing country, you have to be cognizant of the choices you need to make. In a large and complex system, you can't have too many priorities. You've got to find the catalytic levers, the areas that if you fix those, other reforms will happen. So CDE thought long and hard about what the key reforms should be. And in our view, you've got to go back to the Ministerial Task Team reported in 2016 and what they said. They talked about corruption in the education system, and they talked, well, our words, essentially SADTU state capture. SADTU is involved in appointing principals and teachers. And this is inherently the wrong approach. At that time, every Deputy Director General was a member of SADTU. How can you be both management and workers? It's not possible. So there's a core misconception. So our priorities for action were very carefully selected. Firstly, you should implement the recommendations of the Ministerial Task Team. These were leading educationists in the country, and they had very clear recommendations to deal with removing state capture by SADTU, and the police should deal with corruption. Unless you do that, much else that we discuss is irrelevant. So the second thing is you've got to improve accountability. If I don't go to work on a Monday and a Friday and I have a second job, I'd get fired very quickly. But this is not what's happening in our very large schooling system. So you have to have accountability. Now, the minister, 2009 to 2015, tried to do all sorts of things, tried to introduce accountability. She needs credit for that. But it took years and years, and eventually she kept backing down to SADTU. So you need a form of accountability. That's so self-evident that it's hardly bears saying, and we spell out how to do this. You have to bring back the ANAs, slightly improved, but you need to know, not just at matric, but at grade 3, 6, and 9, how are you doing? How are you doing? And why are you doing badly? So the ANAs have to be there, done properly in an appropriate way. You've got to reinvigorate something like the National Education Evaluation and Development Unit, which was sidelined after its first big report, which came out with conclusions nobody liked in the vested interests John talked about. Well, it then became irrelevant. We're saying reinstate a NEDU type body. They must report to Parliament, not under the minister. It must be a public document. And you do need to give principals more power, but they have to be better qualified and so on. So there are 3 approaches to accountability we're suggesting. The third thing we're suggesting is the teacher core, which is absolutely vital. And you need to split this into 3 groups. There are new teachers that need much better training. The training, the experts tell us at our universities, is terrible. It's not meeting what we need. So you need better training, you need better selection, you need testing before they go into schools, and they have to be taught not theory, but how to deal with complex classrooms, which is a very different task. So that's critical, and we have a big opportunity. The second is existing teachers who need much more support, which means you've got to fix the bureaucracy. So not just one visit once a year, if you're lucky, from a subject advisor, but a much more serious approach to supporting teachers who want to do well. And then you've got to acknowledge we have a massive shortage of teachers in the hard subjects, math, science, accounting. And we need to deal with that. And we could deal with that in a week. In a week. You could ask agencies that will provide you with Indian teachers who will be paid more than they are paid in India if they come to South Africa, and you say we need people who've got a teaching record, they speak good English. we could dramatically improve this for poorer schools. So unless reforms get inside the classroom, it's just window dressing. The fourth issue, which nobody likes, but we've got an election coming, we need to have the right expertise at the very top of the education department. It's the minister, it's the DG, and the top team, however big you define that as. They have to be fit for purpose. You might be a great teacher, but you could be a terrible manager. So we have to have at the very top and in the provinces people who understand the reform need and who are change managers. That's what's required. So very important issues. It's time for a new top team. And then lastly, following international experience and the Peruvian example, we need some targets. We shouldn't just say, oh, we must get better. We need to say, this is disastrous where we are now. So what are the targets we're going to set? Well, we've sort of set 2030. We want all 10-year-olds to be able to read for meaning by 2030. Do we have a plan? Do we have a budget? Do we have a champion in the department? No. But there are other targets we should set. For example, take Peru. Let's say every 5 years, we're going to move up the ladder of whichever international test you want. We're going to move up by 10 or 12 countries. That's our ambition. So we need some ambition and some definite targets. And if we don't meet them, we need to know why. And sometimes people have to be fired. So there are a whole lot of things about that. So that's the content. Let me end very briefly by talking about strategy. We think there is a silent crisis about the education situation, which keeps continuing, perhaps getting slightly better or slightly worse. There are not enough people shouting as loud as they can that this is just not good enough. In fact, it's outrageous that 30 years of democracy and we still have one of the world's worst performing education systems. So we need everybody, and thanks to Defend Our Democracy, who heard our plea and have had this as their second event on basic education, but we need everyone to start shouting loudly about a common agenda for reform. And I'm sure there's lots of differences amongst us, but we could agree on a few things. Fit for purpose top team in the provinces and in the national department, led by the minister and appropriate DG and DDGs. Implement the recommendations of the ministerial task team, now 8 years old, which deal with the inappropriate role of the largest trade union, which should, obviously, I'm in favor of trade unions, but I'm not in favor of them managing the Department of Education. And don't forget that the ministerial task team said that SATU was effectively in charge of 6 or more of the province's education departments. This is totally unacceptable. And then targets. So we're saying there could be common ground around 3 things: new team, targets, and implement the ministerial task team recommendations. And those would be catalytic levers to start the process of reform seriously. There are many other issues, but picking the right catalytic issues is absolutely vital if we're going to get reform. So I will end there. I'm sure it's 10 minutes or so, but that's our view on this, and that you've got to cut through 700 issues to get to the core that could start South Africa on a path we should have taken 30 years ago. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anne. Elizabeth, let me hand over to you directly, and then we'll have a bit more of a conversation between the panelists afterwards. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Christine. So after listening to both Anne and John, I think we can all agree we understand what our problems are. Maybe the differences or the diversion comes in how we solve the problems, right? So we agree on what the challenges in the system, the sector, and even the country at large, but the solutions is where we probably differ in terms of positionality and ideology. And I think Anne also raised a really important point in that the education system and what we are talking about is highly complex. It is not as simplistic as this is the A, and then if we apply this thing, we are solving it in 2 minutes. And in this complexity, we also need to acknowledge the role of culture and ideology, because these systems are embedded in our communities and our societies. Whatever is happening in the broader society invariably is shaping the system and the structures that we are trying to reform. And so we can't fix education in isolation to fixing the whole country or the society that we live in. But I mean, that is a conversation and a bigger discussion for another day. So in its complexities, we have to also acknowledge we have come a really long way. And here, context and history matters, right? We are not trying to fix something that like started yesterday or just mushroomed overnight. It's got a really strong, intentional historical design for what it is today and what we are trying to undo and reform. And so to understand what we want to do, we need to understand where we are coming from, and that we've inherited an education system that is inherently problematic. And part of the effort is also trying to undo that sort of damage that was done during apartheid. So it is not, you know, we are trying to do a lot of things at the same time, and that needs to be an important context or consideration when we are talking about 30 years into democracy. What have we done? What have you got to show for? Because part of those 30 years was also trying to undo something, for lack of a sexier word, a lot of garbage or, you know, very terrible things that was done. So we need to also acknowledge that. And yes, South Africa spends a lot of money, or the budget for education is comparatively higher than other similar countries. And we always say that, oh, they're always complaining, they want more money, but education is the biggest line item or whatever. The inherent issue in our system is not so much access, which, you know, we've done very well, especially at the primary level where we've got near universality. Secondary level is on par with, you know, international standards. Our issue becomes, of all the investment or the money we are pumping into the system, we are not getting return on investment, right? So there's an issue with quality deficit in our education system that we need to address. But as I am also saying this, the sector is plagued by a poly crisis. And so if Anne says our problem is not a money issue, I disagree. We have got a money problem. We've got a strategy problem. We've got an accountability problem. We've got an implementation problem. So our problems are many, multifaceted and interconnected, and we cannot address them in isolation. So perhaps I will respond quickly to some points that John made that gives me cause for concern, right? So yes, we understand the role of parents in our education system is vital. The research shows it, the research is clear on it. But in the South African context, it's not so simple, because that is where most of the challenges are actually faced, right? So the inequality in the home environment impacts the inequality in the education outcomes or experiences that we are experiencing to some degree. So if I'm as a caregiver, I cannot read and write, or I've had really poor education, the likelihood of my involvement in my child's education and even in, you know, their whole experience will be limited or non-existent. And so we need to acknowledge the social, cultural sort of impact of some of these things in the education conversations that we're having. It is not as simple as reading to my kid if I myself do not know how to read, or I've had very poor education, you know, training or outcome in the first instance. So yes, parents are key in their involvement in the governance of education and the involvement of the education experience of their children broadly, but our context does not allow for that kind of simplistic, you know, explanation because of our cultural and socioeconomic context. When we talk about the correlation between foundational learning and later success, that is a no-brainer. It is very simple statistics, right? If investment at the foundation age, at the foundation stage is going to save us costs later on in life, and it will probably be a very great investment later on because we will cut down on the number of interventions we need to do in grades 3, grade 6, grade 9, grade 12, and so forth. So that is a no-brainer. But when we are talking about the foundation as well, we need to also think about a whole lot of other issues. So we don't really contest with that. So the foundation itself, it's fragile, this education system we're having. And in that we are putting plaster on a bullet wound, right? So when matric result season comes, we are hyping it to the highest level because that is where we are trying to save a thing at the later stage instead of addressing it at the very foundation and making sure we are tracking all the way through to see success and not just completion rate, but quality exit, right? So they are leaving not with the certificate, but with a certificate that is going to allow them access into tertiary training and even the world of work and meaningful participation in the world of work. And so we are struggling with that. We are struggling with an efficiency issue. So we are dealing with numbers and not quality necessarily. When it comes to the issue of quality and teachers, we tend to overly emphasize the pedagogical aspect, which, yes, it is important. We need to train our teachers. They need to be equipped and empowered and sharp to do the service of teaching, right? But the environment within which we are placing teachers to do the business of teaching matters. And research has shown that the environment actually impacts on teacher motivation and their actual ability to the morale to do the business of teaching. And because teachers occupy such a fundamental and key role in the teaching and learning process, if we do not address the infrastructure or the environmental aspect, we will be investing in this training to no avail, right? So what is happening is we would train qualified teachers, and then parents will see that this school is great for teaching and learning. Everyone will move their kids to that school. We experience overcrowding, and then we are getting diminishing effect because now teachers are overburdened with learner ratios. They cannot give individual attention. They are stressed, and inevitably, the issue that we're trying to address, right, the quality of teaching there is going to suffer because the environment does not create conducive setting for that quality teaching that was initially intended for. So yes, while we're thinking about the pedagogical aspect, we need to also address the environmental aspect so that they are going hand in hand. We are not doing piecemeal approach and basically having a situation where we are taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards. And we do have a money issue in the sector or in the system. And our money issue are twofold. Yes, education is a high investment priority for the country, but the amount of investment is not near the amount needed to address all the challenges within the sector. Everything that we speak of has a cost element to it. Teachers need to be paid. Training is not free. The infrastructure we talk about does not come free. We need to invest in it. But over and beyond the insufficiency of the actual investment is the spending problem that Anne was alluding to. And in that, we have a really poor leadership and accountability in that aspect. There's a lack of oversight from the sector and all of government, right? And so education is not like just reserved to education department. This is all of society approach that will require success. And so we need to apply pressure, and we need to demand for transparency and accountability from every sector, every aspect of it, from parents, from school leadership, from the departments themselves, and from oversight bodies that are put in place to make sure that these leadership systems and management systems run effectively. And if we neglect to play one role, we will see it suffering in another aspect. So oversight and accountability is important for transparency to ensure that the leadership, it is running and we are getting value for money in that aspect as well. We have an implementation problem. And in that, we have sexy policies, taskings, recommendations. We've got lots of things that we've invested in to give us, an edge. But when it comes to implementation, there's a lack of political will, or just very lackadaisical, slow approach to implementation. And when that happens, we can have all the policies we want. If implementation is not there or is not prioritized, we will have libraries of policies and recommendations and guidelines, and nothing is going to change because the stakeholders, the officials, the custodians who are meant to implement these things are not taking it as seriously as they should. Education, basic education, is an immediately realizable right. But we have policymakers who treat it as as and when, as the feeling goes. It's a politicking exercise most of the time. And that is a huge problem when it comes to actually reforming and changing and, getting that education system that we envisaged during the birth of democracy. And we have a strategy problem. And the strategy problem, yes, I agree with Anne, and maybe we might not agree on the very specific strategy, but the sector does not have quality data. Like they plan, they will have plans and guidelines, but they are planning in the dark because some of their data are unreliable, inconsistent. It's very bizarre. So when we use infrastructure, for example, they will tell you that they are addressing infrastructure in schools, but the data they are using is so outdated or unreliable, it begs the question, what exactly are they trying to address? Because the data for eradicating backlogs are not what school communities are experiencing on the ground, right? And so we are planning in the dark because the data is very unreliable and inconsistent. And that is a very poor strategy because if we are planning based on wrong information, in basic statistics, we say garbage in, garbage out. So if the input is flawed, the output is definitely going to be problematic later on. And so in terms of addressing and maybe moving on from highlighting the challenges and looking at ways that we can experience sort of reforms quickly, the low-hanging fruit is obviously, and I agree with Anne on this issue of the more voices, the more pressure, the more champions for accountability and transparency is important. And that pressure must go towards addressing the issue of the lack of accountability and transparency and the lack of implementation in the system. You will find that we have all the recipe, all the ingredients for a very good recipe. Someone who is supposed to mix it together to get the desired dish is not doing their job. And there we need to apply pressure, and we need to call and ask for decisive government and a decisive leadership that is going to put aside political leanings and personal gains to actually do what is needful on behalf of learners and school communities, in all honesty. So I'm going to shut up now, and then we will see what will come out. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Elizabeth. No, I didn't stop you because it was invaluable what you were saying. So thank you so much for your contribution. John, could I maybe give you 5 minutes to just respond? And then I want to take some questions from participants, and then I'll direct them at each of you. So maybe just 5 minutes to respond, and then we just have about 20 minutes afterwards. So let's just try to keep it tight.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I want to thank both of you. I really, and Defend Our Democracy for putting this panel together. I'm really glad to. I think it's a really good conversation and good disagreements we're having. I had a number of mixed feelings. I mean, I raised stuff on SADTU from the same study that Anne referred to about the fact that they're controlling at least 6 provinces' education systems, and obviously that's got to be stopped. I think where I have a difference with both of you is, Liz, you said reform isn't piecemeal, and Anne implicitly said something similar because she said you've got to reform the whole system. Well, I agree with that, but I actually think in a democracy, and given where we are, reform is always peaceful. I know when I was in government, we reformed the radio and television system. And we did it piecemeal. We did it step by step in each area. First, we fixed community radio, then we fixed public broadcasting, then we fixed commercial radio, then we expanded it, then we went on to television. And I think that's the way reform works. I mean, I didn't find much to disagree with it, Anne said, except on the level that who's going to do all that? How is it actually going to happen? Of course, on Liz's point about the socioeconomic problems and cultural problems, of course, I agree with that. I would say in response, the first step is to recognize what the PSUs are. And so I do stick by my piecemeal reforms by saying, if you start by doing some things that are small and piecemeal and work, you improve your credibility to go to the next thing. That's why, I mean, for instance, Anne referred to this question of accountability, and I know that Jonathan Jansen came back, and I can't remember exactly how he phrased his difference with you. But the problem is getting it done. Will it work? Will SADTU step in, make it impossible, and give you a bloody nose? I mean, for instance, if the DA came in and they were the appointed education minister, and they stepped in and challenged SADTU in the first week, I think you've got, I worked in the United Nations and I describe myself as a day after person. I want to know what happens the day after the election, the day after the war, the day after you get a new government. How would you implement that? How would you get it to work? So, I think you've got to, I think our budget needs a massive reorientation. We have developed agencies all over the government that aren't doing what they were supposed to do, and yet they don't close down. They develop bureaucratic inertia. But how you reform is a matter of sequencing to survive. And that's why I suggest that you build a culture of reform by getting some early successes. And one of them would be teachers' assistants, another would be books into schools, and a passionate leader. Now, I would love nothing better than to have an education minister who's a passionate champion of great education, knows the issues and so on. But I don't see that coming from the DA, let alone the ANC or any of the other parties. So Anything else I need to say? Obviously, corruption is a massive crisis. All of it's got to be tackled, but I would say start with things you can succeed, because you build on success. If you try something, if you on day one tackle sanction and they knock you out, and then I think you're worse off than before you started. But let me leave it to others to respond.
Thanks, John. I want to give people from the chat and who are participating to please have an opportunity to speak. I think as you were all presenting, there have been a couple of thoughts and issues raised in the chat. Lots of people agreeing with the fact that implementation is an issue and that we have great policies. I want to maybe just take advantage of my position quickly and put something to all three of you, and then maybe just allow some time for people to please raise their hands and ask their questions as well. And maybe just also to signal to participants, if you do have any questions and you don't want to raise your hand, please just drop it in the chat now. Or if you think what you've asked earlier hasn't been addressed in subsequent presentations, please drop that in the chat so we can pose it to the panel as well. I'm not seeing what all three of you presented as mutually exclusive. Let me put it that way. So where there can be piecemeal reform and broader structural reform, I think that those things can go hand in hand. And I agree with John, where I think it's necessary to have early successes, but it doesn't always need to be the government that those successes are coming from. And I think a lot of what John also focused on was community initiatives, individualized initiatives that are geared at producing different outcomes. Now, I totally understand the need for government to be in charge of leading this charge, but I'm so cognizant of the reality in the country that we are facing right now, and it's difficult to say or to keep going to government and to keep asking for things when you were all talking about consequence management and implementation. You know, we have the regulations on norms and standards that provides for pit latrines to be eradicated. But those timelines come and go, and there's no consequence management. What do we do besides taking the government to court and say, hey, you had a deadline, you haven't met this deadline, what happens now? There's not much consequence management. We don't have performance reviews for ministers to hold them against. And even if we did, what is the alternative in a political system that many people just practice the expression of their wishes by voting and not further than that? So my one question, or not even a question, my contention would be that we need to not be seeing things as either piecemeal or broad structural reform, but maybe just seeing these things as hand in hand. That yes, we would like to hold government accountable, but also how do we start galvanizing the power of ordinary people and using that, because in many cases we just don't have another choice. Linked to that, and I think this also has to do with the notion of piecemeal approach, and maybe just to probe all of you on this question. I come from a family of educators, and my parents are both principals of schools, and I attended schools in Lenasia as well, normal public schools, and from my exposure, I would conclude that things are possible where a principal in charge can do make very specific choices, can make specific choices about teacher training outside of what the government is proposing, discipline in relation to teachers, standing up to SATU, saying what can be allowed, those sort of things. Those can happen in individualized schools. And the principal is a central figure there. And what can be done? Because I think teacher training and all of those things are important. But as you said, Elizabeth, where the environment is not conducive, you can train teachers all you like, and then they get put into a school that the environment isn't conducive, and then what happens? So what focus needs to also be placed on principals, I think, and their role in actually producing an efficient system just in their individual school? And do we have cases of schools like that where this is actually working, and what are those principals doing? Let me take a couple more questions, and then I'll give you all a chance to respond if that's okay. So Stefan, I see that your hand is up. You can unmute and go ahead.
You're muted, Stefan.
Sorry,
Sorry,
okay.
Stefan.
Can you hear me now?
You're good.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks for taking my question. I was thinking that it's really encouraging that there's a lot of agreement that the lack of value for money is a big issue in the education system. I think that's real progress in the way we talk about it. But I think the issue is bigger than a lot of people are thinking, because there is data to show that we're actually the worst in terms of value for money. We get the least return on our investments in education in the world. And that suggests to me that there's something fundamentally wrong with our system. It has to be absolutely dysfunctional for that to be the reality. And that means to me that we have to tackle those aspects of the dysfunction if we want any kind of real progress. And the proof of that is the unbelievably good work that a lot of people have been doing around reading. There's been great interventions over 10 years now, I think, and they've had an impact. They've made a difference. They've improved things. But almost everyone that I've spoken to that's been involved in that has said there's only so far our interventions will take us. And unless the system changes, we won't be able to take this to scale. We won't be able to make this into something that has a real effect. And I think that's the issue we have to think about when thinking about reform. We cannot avoid tackling those things that are making us dysfunctional. And it's the lack of accountability. It's having a trade union in charge of the system. And it's bad teacher training. Those are, I think, three of the most important. And the support, the lack of support that teachers get in our system. If we can start moving on that, and I agree with John that you can't make everything right, overnight. But the thing is to start initiating things that will start making us less dysfunctional and making us the worst performer in terms of value for money in the world, And this is the profound thing that we have to accept. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. So I think there's one more question. Let me just see. Yes, Vanessa, let's take your question and then we'll get quick responses from the panelists, and then we'll maybe do another round of questions before we round up. Vanessa, you can go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. I'd like to relate what Stefan said to the issue of accountability and the senior management at DBE National. What we have found is that when we make submissions to Parliament, DBE protects the Department of Basic Education from taking responsibility for the matters we are raising, because of officials at the department who play some whistleblowing role. We know that they then take that submission to DBE. They email it to them first, then they have meetings about it, but they never ever come back to us. I've seen the Portfolio Committee on Basic Education attacking Section 27, and their first response to their oral submission was, who are your funders and what is their agenda? Elizabeth, I think you said, is from Equal Education. She may be able to tell you that although they worked with DBE on the learner transport policy, what came out of it did not reflect that stakeholder engagement. So I would say that, and in John's previous sessions, we have looked at the role of Parliament as well in accountability. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. I think let's get quick responses, maybe just 2-minute inputs from each panelist. John, let's start with you, then we'll do Elizabeth and then Anne, and then we'll just see if there's any questions toward the end.
Okay, I'll be very quick because I want to hear from other speakers and questions. I would just say that the idea of knowing the big picture is crucial. You need to know the big picture and you need to know what you're aiming at, the big strategic changes you want. But you also have to link that to the micro, which is what do you do first and how do you sequence it? So you build momentum and support. I'll stop there and let others speak.
Cool, thanks, John. Elizabeth?
Yes, and I think what perhaps Anne was alluding to, and my point is that these solutions are not mutually exclusive, right? So I take that point. For me, I also want to caution this aspect of using anecdotal approaches to things, right? So Elizabeth High has a very fantastic principle and things are working, and therefore this is a case study and a template for all. There's the issues that we are addressing at a national level and provincial level are they snowball and filter down to the school level as well. And so if we have a money issue nationally, the money issue is at the school level as well. And so the socioeconomic context I was trying to draw into the conversation also applies at the school level. Sexy principles are not found in Gamashashani, for instance, because they are still dealing with just having enough spaces for learners to enroll or even getting the department to come and build one toilet for them. And so the idea of them performing like some principal in Constantia High is going to be very different. So we need to be mindful of this conversation that when we are calling on government to actually deliver on their mandate, we are putting all the responsibility on government. No, education is all of society's problem, but we have elected people to come and help us to lead that conversation. And we need to hold those people to account. We need to make sure those people are working. And so we cannot, the problem and the challenge is that when we start taking on the role of government, government will stop doing what it's supposed to do, relax, and then things will fall apart. And for us to get the systemic change and reform that we want, we require, we need them to do the mandates that we have called them and put them in office to do. And so while we are doing our part as community members and as citizens, we need government to, we need to hold them to a higher standard and to a higher calling, because we are still paying for these services. It's not free, it's not charity, it's not the kindness of their heart that they do or they're meant to be doing what they're supposed to do. So when officials and these custodians of our important rights are being lackadaisical, they have lack of political will, they're just doing nonsense, we need to be able to stand up and say that this is unacceptable, and then we need to call them to order. And unfortunately, Parliament is also failing us in terms of oversight. And Vanessa is right. It becomes almost like a very useless exercise when you are trying to raise issues that require proper sort of accountability and transparency and consequence management. And because we are having people who are protecting each other, we want to protect our jobs, our baking, and not necessarily do what it is right. And so when that oversight and transparency is lacking, everything is secret, we have to go through 1,000,001 gatekeepers to actually get access, it becomes problematic, right, in terms of highlighting where the challenges are and addressing it. And so all of these things are important. And to maybe Stefan's point, you know, about just the, sorry, did I even miss the point? Maybe I did, but when it comes to mind, I will respond again. But the issues that we are highlighting here is that we have historical context to also apply here. We cannot talk about South Africa's educational challenges in isolation or divorced from that context that we are coming from. And to do that will basically to be playing like we will just be undermining the whole complexities and the challenges that we are trying to overcome here, because we are coming from a really serious issue that we are trying to reform and to transform. And so we need to acknowledge that impact and what it requires to be able to undo what has been done, to be able to get to where we are going as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Anne?
Yes, thanks very much. Really interesting discussion. Elizabeth, the best way to hold politicians to account is to kick them out. Don't vote for them again. That's my first point. The second is, I agree with you. There are very many issues that affect education. You're right to point them out. But what we have to grapple with is that very many much poorer countries than South Africa deliver better education results. So I agree with everything you say, but why do those countries do better than us? And they've also had terrible colonial histories and all sorts of things, but they do better than we do. The third point I want to make is to respond to John. John, obviously reformers, effective reformers have to make choices. Very complex situation. Where do I reform? And it has to be incremental. We know that. Now, too many people say you must go for the low-hanging fruit. You didn't say that, but I'm opposed to that. The key moment in a reformer's life, a politician's life, is the first year, let's call it, first year of your sort of tenure. You've got to deal with the very hard issues first. Now, you don't want to have a battle on every single front, of course not, but you have to go for the right issues. And what we're looking for in South African education is, what are the key catalytic issues? So spending more money on teaching assistants. We know there's been one project that's done this. They selected them, not the government, the president's approach. They selected them very carefully, they trained them, and they put them in the schools. They got some reasonable results. Small project, but obviously hopeful. But we don't have extra money to pay for this on scale. So CDE has chosen some key interventions that are incremental, but in our view, get to the root of the problem. First and foremost, the minister and her top team have to be accountable. Get rid of this bunch because they've kept us at this terrible performance level for far too long. You've got to do that. That's perfectly doable. You could change some regulations so that you can fire some more people in the department as well. So that's one. Secondly, you cannot continue with a bureaucracy as corrupt and as captured as the one we have. Now, clearly, once you accept that as an ambition, you have to do it in the most strategic and well thought through way, but you can't avoid the big issues. And thirdly, teachers have to, the whole area of reform on teacher training, how we select teachers, quality, testing, and evaluation, you have to do this. Without that, you're nowhere. So we're saying you've got to go for fundamental issues in a very strategic, careful way. But to avoid the fundamental issues is the wrong approach. And we will not make progress. We know this from our experience historically the last 20 years, and international experience is very clear. So you've got to be a strategic reformer, and you've got to choose your battles carefully. You've got to mobilize support when you're going to sort of make big steps. And most important, you've got to get the president's backing, which the Minister of Education has never had for dealing with SATU. And you've got to get allies in society ready to back you as well. So that's very briefly the key points I want to make. I think Sizwe says he's been shouting, but then you get isolated. Well, keep shouting, Sizwe. We'll back you. And the more of us who take risks and say the emperor has no clothes, the more effective we're going to be. But we've got to choose a few issues. If you're all over the place and everything is equally important, we're just going to get nowhere at all. And the successful reformers internationally, they focus very clearly on the fundamental issues and they persevere. They keep at it. Thanks. I'm afraid I have to go. It's now 11:30.
That's fine. And I think we're going to wrap up anyway.
Okay.
I don't see any more questions on the chat. And I think this has been such an engaging conversation. I don't know that I can close it better than saying who gets to say the emperor has no clothes. But maybe just as a parting shot, just to say I appreciated this conversation so much, Elizabeth. I think it's so necessary to take cognizance of the socioeconomic, sociocultural, the historical context of our country. But in doing that, also realize we have a very recent history and context of state capture and corruption, and a very recent history, continuing history of a totally unaccountable government and state. And I think that's something all of us agree on, one. And second, I think what we need to think about is whether the reforms we are suggesting are within the acknowledgement of that unaccountable state. Are we asking for more policies and laws that we know can be promulgated and 5 years later, no consequent management for? Are we asking for things that will actually be implementable and practical and realistic within the current state of affairs, and then toward changing that state of affairs? And that's not just an education issue. That's a countrywide issue. That's in every sector, on every level. What do we do with our governance issue? Because every single conversation, John, I'm sure, has led back to that question. There's a leadership issue and a governance issue, and that needs to be fixed as well. So maybe I can end there and just say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to everyone for participating and for engaging. There's one more webinar as part of the series, and I think you will get notification of that from Defend Our Democracy. But thank you, and we look forward to hosting you again, and I hope you have a lovely weekend. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.